Today, we are going to talk about brewing Pilsner. Welcome back to the channel, friends. Today's video is all about the art and science of brewing Pilsner. This won't be an advanced video necessarily with advanced process techniques, but in this video I want to achieve two things. I want to convince you that brewing Pilsner doesn't have to be intimidating, and it doesn't have to be overwhelmingly complicated. So we'll construct this video much like we've done our recipes in the past. Because I don't know your brewing equipment, I'll give you a general sense of percentages in terms of grist composition, and I'll give you some basics in terms of hopping, but it will be up to you to formulate your recipe based on the equipment that you utilize at home. This type of content is a function of your suggestions. So if you guys have ideas for the channel, leave your thoughts down below. Subscribe to the channel. We read all the comments. We respond to as many comments as we reasonably can. Even though your video idea may not be made tomorrow, we have it in the queue. We write it down on the brainstorming list, and hopefully in the future we'll assuage all of your desires. So let's not waste any time, guys. Let's talk about grist composition. Now, I should say this type of Pilsner that I'm going to describe is mostly a German-style Pils. It strikes the balance between that sort of malty and bitterness character that you get from a German-style Pils and the dry, more aggressive character that you get from the traditional Czech-style Pils. And the recipe construct is incredibly simple. With Pilsner especially, I would encourage you not to overcomplicate things. So when you're designing your grist, you can be as simple as using 100% Pilsner malt. Sometimes we see recipes online, Pilsner malt, Carahel, dextrin, Victory, etc., certain percentages. You don't need to go that crazy, especially if you're just starting out. Understand your process first and think too much about your complicated recipe later. I would recommend using 100% Pilsner malt. Now, if you want to add a little bit of texture and character, you can add a sprinkle of Vienna, you can add a sprinkle of Victory, a sprinkle of Carahel, something like 3 to 5%. But really, that specialty malt isn't going to elevate that beer all that much, and I would encourage you to keep it really simple. One more thing that I'll mention in terms of the grist composition and the mash, there's a few school of thoughts here also. One school of thought is control your pH aggressively, try to target that 5.2 to 5.35 range, and in that instance, if you're concerned about that, add some acidulated malt to your mash. Something like 1 to 3%, depending upon your water hardness, would be adequate. Now, speaking of water, I would recommend, if you don't have soft water with your home supply, to get yourself some distilled water or make distilled water. This type of beer will often be better if you start with very soft water. And so, again, if you have hard water, high alkalinity water, high carbonate water, I would recommend either going to the store or making your own distilled water to begin with something that's really, really soft. In terms of the volume of your mash, you'll want to target volumes and efficiencies that get you somewhere around finishing beer of 4.8 to 5.2% alcohol. Personally, I enjoy Pilsner on the lower side of the alcohol range. Makes it a little more crushable, a little bit softer on the palate, but all things considered, write your recipe for a finishing alcohol content between 4.8 and 5.2%. There are many ways to mash a Pilsner. You can do single decoction, double decoction, triple decoction. You can do step mash, you can do protein rest, etc. I would recommend single infusion mash. Most modern malts are highly modified, so if you mash somewhere between 146 and 152, 154, depending on your preference, you're going to be perfectly fine in terms of what you get in the body and texture of that wort. To recap, the grist, super simple. Start with 100% Pilsner malt. If you want to adjust your pH, you can certainly use acidulated malt. If you want to add a little bit of complexity and a little bit more character, you can use Victory, Carahel, Carafoam, and other malts like it to create a little bit of complexity. But for the purposes of this recipe, I would encourage you to keep it incredibly simple. All right, so our mash is now complete. We've got wort in the boil. What are we doing for hops? I mean, your options are relatively limited here if you're trying to make something that's traditional. German style pills, you're going to use Hallertau, you're going to use Tettnanger, you're going to use Spalt, or you're going to use Saaz. One of those four is going to result in a beer that's crisp, fresh, familiar, inviting, and delicious. The higher the hopping rate, kind of the different the hop variety. Personally, I don't think high hopping rates are very amenable to Hallertau and Tettnanger. So if you enjoy things on the lower end of the IBU range, I would say write your recipes with Hallertau and Tettnanger. If you want to push the IBU range, I would recommend Spalt and Saaz. So what range of IBU do I recommend for this recipe? I would recommend something between 30 and 35 IBU. Your bittering addition is going to bring roughly 20 IBUs of that full range. You can use any clean bittering hop to achieve that. I would recommend using a high alpha hop because this is not a flavor contribution. And in terms of efficiency and economic sense, I would recommend using a high alpha hop, Warrior, Magnum, on the bittering side to get your 20 IBUs. And then when the flavor addition happens, I would recommend adding your Hallertau, your Tettnanger, your Spalt, or your Saaz to finish up that other 10 or 15 IBUs sometime between 10 minutes remaining in the boil and flame out. That's going to give you a nice flavor addition with rounding out that bitterness. All right, so to recap so far, simple grist, and then on the hopping side, hop with your favorite noble and traditional hop varieties to achieve something around 30 to 35 IBUs. Now we have a phenomenal, simple, elegant wort that we need to ferment. What do I recommend in terms of yeast? Well, like anything in brewing, there's a million different options, but especially if you're unfamiliar with Pilsner brewing, I would recommend keeping things really, really simple. You could use Fermentis 3470, which is a dry yeast, which is very, 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 very easy to use. Personally, I've never had great luck with dry lager yeast. It always has a hard time cleaning up sort of this Cheerio-like sweetness that comes on the finish. And also, it's a hard time cleaning up the acetaldehyde appley character. But if you're unfamiliar with wet pitches or if you want to keep things simple, 3470 is a great, reliable option for you at home. There are certainly other options that I would recommend, top of which would be Y Yeast 2124, which is going to produce a beer that's a bit crisper, drier, and more traditional. Regarding fermentation process, keep things right around 50 degrees. Once you begin to reach terminal gravity, allow that temperature to ramp up to 55 or higher. You're going to want to make sure you test your diacetyl. In terms of how you conduct a diacetyl test, a forced diacetyl test, I'm sure there's other videos on YouTube, but if there is no other information on diacetyl tests on YouTube, we'll either leave a note in the comments or we'll make a video in the future. In terms of post-conditioning treatment, once you've hit your gravity target and your beer is free of diacetyl, you can begin to step down for the lagering phase of the Pilsner brewing. Again, this is up to personal preference. Sometimes people only like to lager for a couple of weeks. Time is your friend here. Essentially, the longer you lager within reason, the better, more refined, more rounded that beer is going to become. So patience is virtue, especially when you're brewing lager. If you're wanting to turn a beer around in 2, 3, 4 weeks, this is not the type of beer that you should be brewing. Once that lagering phase is complete, you can now either carbonate in your keg, you can do a natural conditioning, or you can force carbonate. I would recommend calculating your numbers to carbonate between 2.5 and 2.8 volumes of CO2. It's up to you whether you want that really gentle, soft carbonation, which is smooth with a light texture, or if you want something that's a bit more zippy that will propel some spicier hops. For example, if I'm brewing a Pilsner with Hallertau or Tettnanger, generally I'm going to carbonate it on the lower side, whereas if I'm using Saaz or Spalt, I might carbonate it a little higher to accentuate that earthy zippiness that I get with those two varieties. I've come full circle as a brewer and as a consumer, as many of you viewers probably have. When you become a craft beer aficionado, you search out beers, they make a huge impression on you, and they're hugely flavorful. Maybe it's a double IPA or a triple IPA. And over time, I've really come to appreciate the character, elegance, history, and simplicity of a Pilsner. And this idea of this recipe, basic Pilsner malt, simple mash program, simple hopping program, simple fermenting and conditioning program, is to say that to make beers of distinction and elegance, you actually have to take things away. In Pilsner brewing, you don't want to overcomplicate things. You don't want too much specialty malt. You don't want too many hop blends. You don't want excessive dry hopping. You want a recipe that's really simple. And to me, the best Pilsner can actually be 4 very simple ingredients. Pilsner malt, hops of your choice, 1 variety, yeast, and then whatever soft water that you have access to. These beers are all about attention, refinement, and process. And in construct, I would love to implore you to keep things like this recipe and these ideas incredibly simple. Guys, your comments in this community is such a joy for me to partake in. I want to thank you guys for watching. Get subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Take care.